Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Juan Carlos Lopez. I am coming to you from Mi'kma'ki, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I say these words as my commitment to listen and listen and listen. And a very dear colleague of mine says, once you are done listening, please go back and listen and listen and listen again. I want to listen to learn about the truth. I want to learn of what had happened and what still happens in these lands. And with that knowledge, move towards decolonization and reconciliation with the advice of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I would also like to acknowledge that these lands I'm coming to you from have received people of African descent in several waves, and the recorded record goes more than 400 years. And that in itself is very rich because that record is of a person that came as a translator between the colonizers and the Mi'kmaq. So as you may imagine, this the Costa person who must have had contact before that, so that he could act as a translator. So that record in itself is also very rich, and I say these words with the same commitment to listen and listen and listen and learn about what had happened and what still happens, and with that moves towards a better and brighter future for everyone. And I say that as a settler and an immigrant in these lands. So thank you very much. I am over the moon doesn't quite describe it. I don't find the words to have my amazing and wonderful colleague Jessica Riddell join us today. I will read a little bit of who Jessica is for those of you, or what Jessica does actually, for those of you who haven't met her. So Dr. Jessica Riddell is the founder of Hope Circuits Institute, a think tank dedicated to system rewiring and the renewal in the post-secondary sector. She is a full professor of early modern literature in the English department at Bishop's University in Quebec, Canada, and she holds the Stephen A. Jarislowsky Chair of Undergraduate Teaching Excellence. In this capacity, she focuses on systems change and in higher education that fosters human flourishing. In her research, teaching, leadership, and administration, she participates in a wide range of conversations at the national and international level about how universities fulfill the social contract to a broader society. She was recently appointed to the vice chair of the American Association of Colleges and Universities, and with more than 1,000 members, mainly in the States, but also internationally. This organization is dedicated to advancing liberal education and inclusive excellence in higher education. She's coming to us currently from Warwick University, where she's a visiting scholar. And on a more personal level, I want to say that, and I think when I did the post online, I described Jessica as my friend, my collaborator, my co-conspirator, my mentor, and my sponsor. So I have really been part of that wonderful work that you do, Jessica, and you have helped me come into this circle, work with others, help each other, and grow with each other. So I'm very grateful for that. And with that, I'm gonna hand it to you. So I will be here on the back doing the tech and watching the thing. But from this point on, Jessica, floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Juan Carlos, and thank you for the invitation to come into a community that I love very much and have been shaped by and inspired around for many, many, many years. As Juan Carlos says, I am a professor at Bishop's and a very, very proud member of the Maple League of Universities, this consortium of universities, liberal arts, primarily undergraduate, serving rural and regional communities, doing heroic work despite often the conditions within which we fund and value higher education in Canada. So it is such a warm return, and I feel like I'm at home, although I'm very, very far from home today. Juan Carlos mentioned that I'm at the University of Warwick in Coventry in the UK. I'm in a 25-day visiting professorship where I have been encountering folks from the University of Warwick, but also teaching and learning networks across the UK. I've been at Sheffield Hallam University, Leeds Met, Leeds, and really just sitting and listening with some curiosity about the national sector of the UK, which is really helping me see the edges and the shape of the Canadian national sector of higher education. So what I'll do is I will share some of the things that I've learned over the last 20 days or so with my jet lag, mushy brain, but also give us a set of tools, a set of conceptual frameworks for us to see our own ecosystems more clearly. And so, it's a privilege for me to step outside of the sector in order to see my own work, my own institution, my own change invitation a little bit more clearly, a little bit more differently. But I promise I will not be coming back with an English accent. Okay, so as Juan Carlos says, my name is Jessica. I'm a humanist, I'm an early modernist, I'm a Shakespeare scholar. I'm really, really interested in how we make meaning together. I'm really committed to the fact that I have these sort of three principles I keep coming back to and returning to and revisiting, especially over the last couple of months. And I'm going to propose those to you, and then I'm going to come back to them at the end of the session. It is increasingly urgent, I think, for me to imagine higher education as a rehearsal space for creative futures. It's a place where we imagine what else is possible. It's where we understand both the world as it is and how it could be. So that's my first proposal. My second proposal is that universities and classrooms in particular are playgrounds for courageous becoming. So we create these opportunities for us to encounter each other, encounter otherness, encounter ideas, encounter disciplines, not as a way of reifying or fixing our identities, but as an invitation of courageous becoming, that we can be something different, that we are unfurling and transforming in real time. And then that third proposal or principle I've been thinking about and rumbling around is that we are the incubators, higher education incubators for a civic imagination. And by civic imagination, I mean the ability to wonder, to be curious, to imagine something else is possible, not just for ourselves and our own success or our own individual prosperity, but in collective and entangled ways. So civic imagination is the way in which we understand the world around us as interdependent, as connected, borrowing from Desmond Tutu's notion of Ubuntu, I am because you are. That notion of what does it mean to be in a collective and how do we imagine together so we can really inspire and catalyze collective lift? How do we get to a place that is more just, more inclusive, more equitable, more joyful, more flourishing for all of us entangled in these ecosystems? I'm going to use the metaphor of ecosystem quite a bit over the next 50 minutes or so. But those three proposals, that higher education is a rehearsal space for creative futures, that it is a playground for courageous becoming, and that it is an incubator of a civic imagination. So what do we do with that? If we agree in principle and we can rumble on what those concepts mean and where they come from and the genealogy of thoughts that we can place them within, but if we believe those are kind of fundamental things that we can play with and see ourselves in, what do we do with that? So what now what? Right? And I think about that all of the time. And I've been thinking about it with different thought partners in different sectors and different spaces for quite some time right now. And I can tell you that I'm living into questions more than I have any answers. And so I'll share the questions that I have been asking and invite you all to think with me through some of these complexities. One of the sites that I was living into these questions about was, as Juan Carlos mentioned, I am the vice chair, the first Canadian vice chair of the American Association of Colleges and Universities. So it's 1,000 universities, mostly in the US, all of them with a mandate for a liberal education. Committed to inclusive and accessible education for all, sitting in radical humanization, curiosity, and learning between and across disciplines. So, in my role, I was there in Washington, D.C. during the World Economic Forum at Davos in Switzerland when Mark Carney delivered his speech on January the 20th. And I have to tell you, I was in the middle of board meetings and my phone lit up. I just kept getting texts and messages and emails saying, "Have you heard this speech?" And I hadn't because I was in meetings. And everyone said, "You've got to go hear this speech because it's connected to Hope Circuits." So the people who are familiar with the Hope Circuits work, a book that I wrote about and with 300 people to imagine how to rewire universities and other organizations for human flourishing. Everybody who had read the book or had encountered the project sent me a little note and said, "You got to go read this speech, go see it, go visit it." And so I did. And as I was listening to the speech, because of course I'm biased, I believe in higher education as the sector that's going to help us figure this world and all of its uncertainty out. I believe in what John Dewey said about higher education, where he said that democracy has to give birth to itself every generation and that education is its midwife. I believe that. And I am open to other people working in other sectors with this same illuminated purpose. But for me, I see the world through the mandate that we have. And so I was listening to this speech, and the speech was for me about higher education. It was to us, it was about us, it was for us. There were three really important pieces in his speech that I want to sort of rumble with you all about and our responsibilities and joy in higher education. First of all, of course, Mark Carney is a perfect example of a liberal arts training, right? He manages to cite an Athenian historian, a Czech theater maker slash dissident slash president. He uses algebra as a metaphor. Like, this is a restlessly interdisciplinary speech with all of its, its own rhetorical and ideological flaws. We can talk about extractive natural resources and whether this is new or this is just a new way of confronting the world around us. But what I thought was so powerful about his speech were these sort of three things, these three movements. The first one is that he said that we are no longer in a time of disruption, we're in a time of rupture. And what I was so struck by there was that disruption assumes a return to normal, right? Regularly scheduled programming is being disrupted, but we will resume activities after this interruption. That's what disruption as a kind of narrative suggests, that there will be a return. There will be business as usual. There will be everything will be back to normal in no time. And my goodness, that was a narrative we heard a lot in COVID. And even just saying that out loud right now, my body dysregulated a little bit. There's a lot of toxic positivity, a lot of gaslighting, a lot of shelter in place, get your pandemic puppy, work on your sourdough starter, and everything will be fine. We'll go back to business as usual. Trudeau and Boris Johnson used the phrase build back better. And every time they did, I threw up a little in my mouth. It was gross because it wasn't marking a point of our own transformation and difficulty. It was erasing the discomfort of this moment and saying, just shelter in place, hunker down, the storm will pass. And that felt increasingly disingenuous during COVID, and it's increasingly disingenuous in our new sort of conditions of geopolitical instability. So when he said we are in a time of rupture, not disruption, what he was doing was saying we keep telling stories about continuity, right? Keep going, keep working hard under deteriorating conditions, build some resilience, we'll bounce back or snap back to status quo. And he disabused us of that narrative, or at least made it visible to us. We are not in a time of continuity, of interruption, of disruption. We are, in fact, at a moment of rupture. Now, I've been using over the last 2 years language of paradigm shift, right? So that one dominant paradigm of higher education is collapsing. We've been tweaking it, and we've been tweaking Canadian higher ed pretty much since the end of the Second World War, although education historians can tie our model to the late 19th century or the birth of industrialism. I don't really care when it starts. All I care about in this space is that we have been tweaking the same model over and over, and we've been running out of room. The anomalies have started to accumulate that we can no longer have the tools to assimilate back into the dominant paradigm, and it is collapsing. And I borrowed that language from Thomas Kuhn in his notion of scientific revolution, where he talks about paradigm shifts that are inevitable, right? That we have anomalies that we can no longer account for, and a new paradigm emerges at the end of an old paradigm. It's the way that we learn and evolve and change our thinking about the world. We understand the world is, not flat anymore because there was a dominant paradigm that collapsed and a new one that emerged from the ashes of that. But what I love about Kuhn is in that shift of a dominant paradigm into a new one, there's this space, there's an interstitial space that he calls extraordinary research. It's the in-between. It's the threshold that we need to cross. It's the tools we need to excavate in order to build a new paradigm. And in this time, Thomas Kuhn talks about it as a place. I love that he calls it extraordinary research, right? It's not the desert, it's not the sort of threshold, it's not the in-between, it's not the third space. It's extraordinary because you get to go back to fundamentals. You get to build shared vocabulary. You get to put things together that are not usually put together. You get to throw things at the wall and seize what sticks. You can be audacious, you can be bold, you can fail and fail quickly as you sense make this moment and work as architects to build a new paradigm. So I've been using that language for a number of years now, and that really is one of the fundamental principles and starting points of hope circuits. But over the last 2 years, I have found that that language is not vivid enough for the moment we are experiencing. I wrote hope circuits before ChatGPT hit the market. Like that aged real fast, real soon, although we can make a defense of or an apology for hope circuits as a way of metabolizing all kinds of technological and social disruptions, including generative AI. But the book was at a particular moment written in the middle of COVID. I wrote the book I needed to read in my pajamas with a pandemic puppy, sense making the world in conversation with 300 folks and trying to metabolize this moment in real time, to make sense of it, to have tools for sense making, and then to share it with folks who are also struggling at this moment. So that was the genesis of the book and the language of paradigm shift. But what I have increasingly started to think about is not paradigm shift, but collapse. That we are seeing the collapse of a dominant paradigm, the collapse of what we thought we knew, the collapse of narratives. That's what Mark Carney is giving us, is we can't say disruption anymore. We actually need to sit in rupture, right? That collapse is happening in real time. And I'm going to introduce collapse as a concept a little bit later around ecosystems. But collapse, when I hear collapse, I immediately think of collapse as catastrophic, right? Oh my goodness, this thing is collapsing in and of itself. But a second possible response to collapse can be using it as collapse into bed, collapse in relief, collapse in laughter, collapse into something else is new. There is an emergence in collapse as well. In life cycles of ecosystems, a tree has to collapse in the forest in order to have the fecundity necessary for mushrooms to grow. So I've been thinking about and worrying around and rumbling over collapse, but Mark Carney gave us rupture. And I'm not quite sure what to do with it. And I'm not sure how to hold it in space other than practice my own close reading and discernment and try to figure out where, without gaslighting or toxic positivity, there is an opening, an entry point, an invitation, and a place to plant seeds for something else to emerge. So that's the first thing I really saw in his speech. The second thing that I saw was him encouraging us to reflect on what our default responses are to crisis. And we certainly are seeing crisis, lack, scarcity in real time in our universities, in our communities, in our geopolitical landscape. How we are responding tells us about who we are as individuals, as communities, as organizations. And what Mark Carney did, which I thought was very generous, is he gave the opportunity, he named the default response of nations at a moment of disruption where he said, it might seem like a good idea, all of you nations, to exercise fortress knowledge, to, flood the moat, raise the gates, build the walls, to protect resources, to stabilize your own economy, to retreat to your own nation. And what he did was he framed it with grace. This would be your default response. This is how you respond to crisis. This is what happens in dominant paradigms when you are under pressure, when you are besieged. And certainly we as Canadians know that feeling of being besieged. The 51st state, which started as a joke, has become real and alarming, and Greenland was a test case. And, we're seeing a kind of vulnerability that we haven't seen in generations. And so Carney says your first response might be fortress logic, build higher walls, protect your resources. But that would be a mistake because the world of fortresses is less good, is less kind, is less about flourishing and more about protection. What he gives us is the opportunity for a second learned response. And that second learned response is building a coalition of middling powers, of people who might not have all of the control over the resources or the sort of the economic heft internationally, but have tremendous power to tackle particular issues together as unlikely allies in these complex and wicked problems. There is a kind of invitation. He's catalyzing the civic imaginations of middling powers. And as soon as I heard that, I thought of the Maple League. I thought of different kinds of consortia of universities. I did not think, and hello to all y'all U15s out here, you are welcome too, because we're all different kinds of middling powers. But where do these small, mighty, beautiful universities that are often overlooked in, federal research and infrastructure funding, where can we catalyze the civic imaginations of our universities in order to imagine something different, to tackle wicked problems, to build coalitions and conversations? Mark Carney is talking about that in terms of nationhood, but I saw that as a real invitation across our sector to imagine what does it look like instead of resource allocation, territorialism, fortress logic, silos and compartmentalization, which we're really good at, by the way. Higher education, super good at fortress logic. Departments, fight against one another for diminishing resources. We're not. That's our default response. And I have to just hold it with grace. We have developed those default responses in times of scarcity to survive broken systems in deteriorating conditions. We have not been given the amount of time and space to exercise the civic imagination to build a second learned response. And we fail to do so now at our peril. We have a moment. We are in the midst of extraordinary research for our sector, for education as the midwife for democracy, as the critical front line for a civil and just society. What are we going to do? Are we going to have a default response, which is to retreat, resist, become intractable, and change resistant? Are we going to fulfill the punchline of almost every joke of almost every book about higher education? I'm just going to give you one example. Rosenberg's book, Whatever It Is, I'm Against It, Change, Resistance in Higher Education, a damning indictment of the academic enterprise. The good news is he's quite democratic about who he indicts. He indicts students for being snowflakes. He indicts faculty for being change resistant, gatekeepers, and lazy. He indicts senior administrators for being inept and stupid. He indicts boards for being out of touch. He indicts governments for not for failing to recognize the academic enterprise, right? These books, you've read a million of them, I'm sure, about higher education. This is why you can't have nice things, is the title, the subtitle of all of these books. It's not helping us. In one hand, it's really useful to diagnose the problem, right? To look at it, to dismantle it, to look at it from different kinds of sides. We need to diagnose. And if we're not also doing a yes and, where we are challenging the actual in the name of the possible, we are only doing one half of it, which is diminishing us, depleting us, and burning us out. When we start to name the problems, they become overwhelming and we lose our sense of empowerment and agency. The second thing has to be possible. The second learned response has to be available. We have to engage in civic imagination to say, yes, here's what's wrong. And yes, here are some creative structural alternatives. And I think that's what Carney in his Davos speech was inviting us to do, to move from the grace of surfacing our learned default response and to say, yes, and what else is possible? The third piece, and I think really tied to the spirit of the creation and continued and sustained collaborations across the Maple League, is that middling powers of coalitions moving in the same direction, still thinking different things, which is my favorite definition of a social movement. How do we create and activate the middling powers? I had a great conversation with somebody when the federal government came out with funding for attracting chairs from the US and from around the world. And this person said, this is the great opportunity for the U15 to come and take a leadership role in shaping higher education in Canada. And because I love that as an idea and as a hope, but I also have seen how it is anchored in practice differently, my question was, why would they be incentivized to do anything other than continuity? They're benefiting from a system that is designed for the big powers. Where are the middling powers? Where are the UNBCs? Where are the Mount Ellisons? Where are the Acadias and the Bishops? Where are the federated colleges? The St. Mike's at U of T, the Thomas More College in Saskatchewan. Where are they in this mix, in this set of conversations? Especially as our middling powers, our amazing universities are educating so many of our undergraduate students, 80% of Canadian students, of students going through Canadian institutions, their terminal or final degrees at the undergraduate level. We are the highest educated group in the world. Mark Carney pointed that out, right? The OECD says that we are the highest educated population. We have at any given time 1.4 million students going through our institutions. Where are we shaping the conversations? And I think that it's a really interesting middling space that we can occupy and take a leadership role around. Okay. So what does that mean? That's Davos. I have to tell you, when I was giving a talk in Washington, D.C., the day after I was giving a talk to, there are 500 people in the room. I quoted Kearney and the room, and I was in the middle of a sentence, and the room erupted into applause. That told me something about the collective appetite for something else is possible, for new narratives, for new stories, for new ways of being in the world, um, for moving towards a world that is entangled in ecosystem. I also have referenced Kearney several times during my visiting professorship over the last few weeks in the UK. Again, recognition, awareness, gratitude, appetite, openness for something else is possible. He really did something with that speech, really gave us a different way of storytelling and an invitation for us in higher education to really manage and metabolize this moment in real time. So what does this do? How do we do it? How do we do it in our own context? How do we do it in our own spheres of control, our spheres of influence, and our spheres of care in our organizations that are chronically underfunded and full of scarcity and have been managing austerity and disruption and labor strife for years? I make the joke that Bishop's University's unofficial motto is teetering on the brink of extinction since 1843. And I think that there is, both humor in that, but there's also knowledge. Like, we know how to do this. We know how to think in creative ways in conditions of limitation, that we can be innovative and playful without gaslighting ourselves, right? Without engaging in toxic continuity and positivity, that we can stay with the trouble long enough to figure this out. I fundamentally believe that the tools we need to build the new paradigm of higher education are hiding in plain sight. We already have them. We've been studying them for our entire time. We've been doing this kind of immersive work. So what do we need to do? I think one of the things that I have found so useful in my own work is comes from a Quaker philosopher named Parker Palmer. And Parker Palmer wrote a book called The Courage to Teach, which I read every May. Mostly because I get the blues after the academic year ends and I have to I walk around and I'm kind of grumpy and my husband's like, oh yeah, it's the second week of May. It's your normal, regular grumpy time. And I'm like, what? He's like, yeah, this is the time where you actually take Parker Palmer off the shelf and you walk around and you grump and then you go to bed and you read this book and you come out a much nicer human. I don't know if my husband's on the call. Hello, Rob, if he is. Um, so in Parker Palmer's Courage to Teach, he gives a very elegant, very simple, but for me, an incredibly useful set of tools for managing this moment. And it's rhyming, you can remember it, it's super easy, it's name, claim, and aim. So what you have to do encountering any kind of fire, whether it's a giant crisis or a small one, the stalling of a project, even a difficult student or encounter with a colleague, to name, claim, and aim is to do the sort of three-step process of naming it, which is saying it out loud, giving shape to it, just naming it. What is the problem? What is the issue? What does it look like? And then if you can name it, if you can say it out loud, you can claim it. And by claiming, Parker Palmer talks about understanding the forces that are converging around you in real time. So, what are the things that are happening, whether it's relational, structural, cultural, that are creating the conditions for this thing to be happening? So, you're claiming it. And then what you're doing is within that kind of diagnosis of understanding those convergences, you can see where you can actually intervene. What is within your sphere of control? What's within your sphere of influence, and what is actually outside of any of the things that you can control. I just read this study that about 80% of the things that we worry about are outside of our control. We have no control over them, and we spend 80% of our time worrying about things we cannot change. And I wonder, even if we can change that to 50%, what would that do to open up the civic imagination necessary to challenge the actual in the name of the possible? So that claiming is really taking a systems level approach. It's seeing things that are converging and figuring out where you can intervene. And then that third one, aim, is how do you move one step in front of the other towards a direction where you're agentic, you're empowered, you're an architect in your own sphere of control and control and influence. So that name, claim, and aim has been an incredibly useful and probably daily mantra for me as I navigate the world and metabolize it in real time. So it has helped me in my journey over the last 2 years. And so I think in the next 20 minutes or so, I want to share some of the learning that I've had over the last 2 years as I wrote Hope Circuits, almost exactly 2 years to the day it came out. Landed on my doorstep. I opened up this book. I wrote the book I needed to read. I didn't write it with the readership in mind for the first time ever in all of my scholarship. Hi, Tracy. Thank you. Yay. I opened the book up. It showed up on my doorstep, and I turned the page open and thought, oh my God, I hope nobody reads this book because I say a bunch of quiet things out loud. I'm a little bit sweary. My mother read it and she's like, did you need to drop those F-bombs? Sometimes the only correct answer to the world that is on fire is an F-bomb. I only dropped 2 F-bombs and in very strategic ways where I could not find all and replace all. But the book came out and has taken me on a journey which I could not have planned. And I am absolutely and incredibly honored to do this work. In the last 2 years, I have been at 70 colleges and universities and engaged with 50 associations or organizations. I was initially brought in to work with folks who were living into integrity. And the adopters of the book were unlikely. I thought teaching and learning folks were going to take it, faculty were going to take it, faculty associations were going to take it, academic adjacent spaces were going to pick it up, student associations would finally get a kind of demystified guide behind the veil of what happens and how a university operates. The folks who were early adopters of the book were university presidents and senior leadership teams and board chairs. And what they took seriously is, I think it's on page 6, where I say in the book, higher education has an integrity problem between what we say and what we do. We have all of these shiny mission, vision, and values. We have great recruitment brochures. We have all of this hype. We drink our own Kool-Aid often. We buy our own press between what we say, and then when we actually look at how those things are operationalized, there's a gap. I just want to mark the fact that in any aspirational, social mission driven organization, there's always going to be a gap, right? We're always going to be reaching, we're always going to be hoping and aspiring to be better than we are, right? That's where hope lives, is in the future. But what I think was taken very seriously by the early adopters of this book is that we need to mind the gap and take steps continuously and iteratively to close the gap through real intentional interventions across our campus ecosystem. So I was brought on to campuses, sometimes with boards in retreat, sometimes with senior leadership teams in retreat, increasingly with senates who are really interested in elevating their thinking about governance and stewardship, to sit in rumbly spaces and say, how do we name the gap? How do we mind it? And how do we close it? So a kind of version of Parker Palmer's name, claim, a name. So these folks were living into integrity. They were willing to have big, rumbly conversations. They were willing to sit in candid spaces where they acknowledged that things are not perfect. They were willing to bring together different kinds of thinkers from really different lived experiences, intersectionalities, and disciplinary lenses in order to sense make at this moment, to mind the gap and close it. So those were the early adopters. But then the word got out that I was sort of hosting these retreats and people were coming and engaging and even possibly interacting differently with one another. And so I started to get invited onto campuses and into ecosystems that were in repair mode. So an acute crisis had happened, usually a president and or senior leaders had been removed and replaced. Sometimes a board had been removed and replaced. Sometimes there was a scandal. Sometimes there was just a series of death by 1,000 paper cuts where there was a collapse in an acute crisis, and this ecosystem was rebuilding trust, rebuilding community, rebuilding at the relational level. So I was brought into these places to hold spaces of repair. So that means very different kinds of engagement. Instead of strategic visioning, it was listening, sense making, holding space, creating collective sense making in all of its forms, rumbling on shared vocabulary. What do we mean by success or retention or governance or mentorship? It can be of any of those themes, but it really was coming into these spaces where people were still in hypervigilance. So hyperarousal or hypoarousal, people were like still kind of yelling at each other or at least close reading the world. Is this going to be any different? Is this just the same rhetoric from a different person, or can something different happen? And there were still people tentatively in hypoarousal dipping their toes back into the ecosystem. Can I trust this place? Is it safe? Can I engage? Do I matter? And so those were very different ways of facilitating. And so I started to see those. And then the word got out, and ecosystems that were in the midst of collapse started to invite me onto campus. In the midst of collapse, sometimes literally people yelling at each other with bullhorns across street corners. Decisions were not being made at Senate or the board. There was incredible levels of vitriol. Grief had hardened into anger, and it was no longer possible for us to run the organization. And so they were in real-time collapse. And in those times when I'm brought in, and I very early on in this, my host was like, "You're going to get yelled at." And this retreat, where we don't even know who's going to show up. And if they do show up, they're going to yell at each other. They're going to weaponize it, and they'll probably yell at you. And I really apologize in advance. And I was like, I don't really want to go into that. I'm a pathological people pleaser. I don't want to get yelled at ever. And I'm not a consultant. I'm a research chair. I'm writing about this. I'm sitting as a learner. Like this isn't my business. I have a whole gig as a Shakespeare scholar. I don't want to get yelled at. That's not going to bring me joy. And then unfortunately I had to reread my own book. I mean like, so one of the conceptual tools in Hope Circuits is stay with the discomfort and be curious enough to ask, when am I supposed to learn from this? So I had to follow my own advice, deeply inconvenient, and go into these places of collapse. And what I realized, and I seeded this concept earlier in our conversation, but want to bring that and highlight that for you all now, is that sometimes collapse is not catastrophic. Sometimes it's a relief because the community members have been holding together with duct tape and sheer force of will organizations that are not sustainable. And that has human cost. That costs us something. So to be able to say the quiet things out loud in spaces where people could meet each other and say, this isn't working, was a relief. And what was so surprising about these retreats is being brought into these spaces, but after a day or 2 days together, there was tears, there was belly laughter, there were hugs, there were moments of people, and sometimes the objective of gathering in these spaces of collapse is very simple. It is everybody in the room by the end of the day or the end of the retreat should recognize each other's common humanity. That should be a low bar, folks. It's not. It's sometimes a really high bar in spaces of toxic continuity and collapse. What I started to realize is who was not inviting me onto campus. I won't say it's all of the U15s, but I will say I've only been to one of the 15 U15s. The organizations that are not bringing me onto campus to do this Hope Circuits work are ones that I would call toxic continuity. So toxic continuity is in times of scarcity, crisis, lack, loss, deficit. The dominant order, the dominant paradigm doubles down on the tools of the center, which means consolidated decision making, the exile of truth tellers, the inconvenience of truth, treating people with policing, surveillance, and compliance, lack of transparency, increased silos and compartmentalization, um, and narratives that put folks into dysregulation. We don't have enough this. We don't have enough students. We don't have enough money. We don't have enough staff. We don't have enough government funding. We don't have enough research dollars. We don't have enough. And that can be rhetoric that creates and perpetuates scarcity. Those systems I stay up at night worrying about. Toxic continuity, holding together these organizations with duct tape and sheer force of will, where the folks who are working on edges and margins around justice, and justice I borrow from Cornell West's definition of love done in public, these folks feel increasingly estranged and alienated from the very organizations that give them purpose and vocation. They're not great ecosystems to live in. There's lots of disengagement. There's lots of nervous system dysregulation. There's lots of hypoarousal, right? That freeze and fawn. Lots of hypervigilance, worry, and just departure. Quiet, silent. Folks don't show up in a room anymore. So as I was sort of going through and starting to see now 70 colleges and universities and 50 associations, I didn't see this until halfway through my journey. And it really was pattern recognition. I had to go to enough of these ecosystems to recognize that each one of them was unique and differentiated, and yet some of them share the same features, the same conditions, and they demand different kinds of interventions and facilitation. There's a, maxim that says you can't teach somebody to swim when they're drowning. You can't go in with a 5-point strategic plan if an institution is in collapse, right? You have to hold the space differently. You have to navigate it. You have to name, claim, and aim it in very different kinds of ways. But I started to think about what was the ecosystem that was missing? What was the ecosystem that we all hope for and try to move towards? And that ecosystem for me is flourishing. And that flourishing ecosystem has a clear sense of purpose, shared stewardship. And by shared stewardship, I mean that everybody within the ecosystem believes that they belong and their contributions matter to the long-term sustainability and health of the organization. So that is everyone from Bill Owen, interim president of UMBC, stewarding with justice and inclusion and joy and delight, recognizing his role as a fiduciary and leader of a complex organization, while also recognizing that Trudy at the Dewhurst Dining Hall, who checks student IDs 3 times a day when students come in for their meals, is an essential steward as well, that she is our superhero of student retention and resilience and regulation because she makes people feel seen and that they matter and they belong. Hey, Bryn, how you doing? How was your weekend? Juan Carlos, did you go see your mama? Sandy, how you doing with that test that you're thinking about? Those moments of encounter, granular, proximate, intimate, human matter. And when we tell Trudy that she is a steward of this complex organization, she believes it. And Larry in Buildings and Grounds, who waves to you across the quad, every single member of that ecosystem is a steward. They're going to do different roles. They're going to play very different roles in this, but they feel that they belong and they matter to the long-term and relational health of the organization. That is an ecosystem of flourishing. An ecosystem of flourishing is also including truth tellers, folks sitting on edges and on margins, folks who are historically excluded or overlooked or undervalued, are at tables collectively sense making and showing us how those systems are enacting structural, relational, and lateral violence. If we are working within systems that are designed for us, we do not encounter them with violence. They're often invisible to us. We are immersed in them like we are immersed in water. It is only when you are encountering systems that are not designed for you that you run up against them and you experience a different relationship to the system. So that if you've got Tony being like, I don't know what you're talking about, Jessica. This was fine for me. I enrolled in that course, no problem. The system might have been designed for him. He's also a beautiful systems thinker and fabulous navigator of the world. But then I am doubly excluded because not only do I experience the structural violence of not being able to navigate the system structures, policies, or platforms, is I also then am questioning myself. Am I not worthy enough? Am I in deficit? Is there something wrong with me? Do I belong and do I matter? And we must, in a flourishing ecosystem, it's not without wobbles. Flourishing has candid, contested spaces where we can deliberate across difference. It's not the erasure of difference. It is understanding that difference is a feature, not a flaw of being in the world together. And so that flourishing is shared stewardship, inclusion of truth tellers, valuing edges and margins, collective sense making, a commitment to building shared vocabulary, and a sense of a co-created vision where on one page we can all sit with this one piece of paper in every table that is decision making and say, does this decision get us closer or farther away to our mission? And it can be everything from the parking committee to the budget. And the parking committee, do not underestimate the power of the parking committee, because if I take away Trudy's parking pass or if I double it in cost, is she going to say, hey, Tom, nice to see you. How was your weekend? When she's worrying about how she's going to make up that money from another place in her already probably undervalued, undercompensated role. Every decision we make, we can say, does it take us closer or farther away to our shared and acknowledged stewardship of this complex organization? It's not proscriptive, but it is a way of decision making that is really powerful in an ecosystem of flourishing. Now, I lived in an institution that was flourishing. We had one piece of paper. I don't know if anyone as bishops was here. We had 11 liberal education competencies. And in hiring committee meetings, in resource allocation meetings, in curriculum meetings, we said, how are these mobilizing the 11 competencies we agreed upon? Built and created and consulted in community with one another. That's pretty spectacular. What I can tell you is in these 5 modes of ecosystems, I'm going to read them out to you. I'll stick them in the chat. I'm happy to send you some resources afterwards. But the 5 modes of ecosystem: toxic continuity, collapse, repair, integrity, and flourishing. Those 5 modes are not static, they're not fixed, they're not inevitable, they're not linear, and you can toggle back and forth between them. They're also very important to note, not monolithic. So at any university, at any given moment, you can have one committee meeting that is, or department or ad hoc project that is in flourishing. And then you can have another department right next door that is in toxic continuity, and another one that's in collapse, and another department that is struggling with repair after difficulty. And it's not inevitable that toxic continuity goes into collapse. Name, claim, and name it, and be like, oh, I think we got a couple of unfortunate tendencies here. You can intervene and get into integrity pretty quickly. The good news is it's not inevitable, it's not predestined, it's not fixed. It's constantly moving and constantly adapting, as our living, breathing ecosystems are. So the power of this mode of a diagnostic framework is not to create deficit. Oh no, we insert institution are in toxic continuity. Wring your hands, clutch your pearls. It is a, hey, here are some features, here are some design principles, and here are some matched interventions we can take right now in our own sphere of control, influence, and care that we can change the momentum. And there's this beautiful theory by Michel Foucault who talks about heterotopias. So within a larger ecosystem, this larger kind of organization or world, you can create pockets of flourishing where you are right now. And you can create them, intentionally design for them, nurture them. Might not be able to change the larger institution depending on where and how you live, the positional authority you have, and the influence that you wield. But you can create in your own space a pocket of flourishing. You can think about it, you can design it, you can build coalitions of the willing, you can sit in shared stewardship, you can create the conditions of belonging and mattering in your pocket of flourishing, whether you are a first-year student or a second-term university president or anyone in between. And that is incredible. That's what hope demands of us, that it is agentic, that we are architects of creative futures, that we can make in real time where we are right now.
Jessica,
That is
we are
terrifying.
we
Yeah.
are at 5 minutes to
Oh,
the end.
thank you.
Just
I
to
love it.
remind you, yes.
Thank you. So the next part of, and this is where I will let you live into questions, both in the last 5 minutes, but in your world, is I had the deep hubris of seeing this framework, excavating it, discovering it, not inventing it, just seeing it with pattern recognition, and quite exhilarated by it because it allowed me to see the shape of different things differently. But I had a moment where I realized that it was also useful in my own life. That within my life, in any given sphere of my own personal, messy journey through the world, those modes of ecosystem were incredibly helpful. So I'm the parent of a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old, which means I can only describe that as living into integrity between what I say and what I do. And my kids will call me to account every single day between you said this, but you're actually doing this. And I have to sit in the deep discomfort of being in integrity as a parent. I feel that I am in flourishing with my research. I get to go and talk for most of my time is spent in conversations with beautiful humans who think differently than me. That's amazing. I love that. But I'm also in toxic continuity in some of my relationships. I'm in repair with my own body and perimenopause. And as I confront middle age and my sort of hip keeps collapsing, I'm in collapse in with aging parents, with infrastructure that is not set up to manage different kinds of complexity. So within my own life, I don't live in one mode and I toggle between and across them. But it has allowed me to release the narrative that I have to be flourishing in all spheres and encourages and invites me to just name it, just think about it, just to see the shape of it, to hold it up to the light, to catch a kind of edge of it. And then that claiming piece, understanding where I can act one foot in front of the other. Sometimes it's just getting out of bed in the morning, right? It can be as simple and elegant as that, or choosing to have a chat with somebody waiting in line for a coffee, even though I'm tired and grumpy. And then it's the aim. How do you aim it in generous and generative ways in future facing spaces? So I hope that that ecosystemic framework of flourishing might be able to be helpful for you in your own context. And if we had more time, and I would love to lock y'all in a room during a Hope Summit and rumble on this in real time with really good food, is I would ask you questions like, where is your institution across that ecosystemic mode? And you can be moving towards them, right? You can be like, we're in repair moving towards integrity, or we're in whatever at the institutional level. Then the next question is, where in your own department, space, committee are you living? Where are you as an individual? And then what are the ways in which we can name the gap? We can mind the gap, and we can close the gap without massive resources, without any, incredible thing that's going to save us from on high, but in real ways that we can anchor and practice this week, this month, this year. And that is the subject of my book. I've got pages and pages and pages of ways, of strategies, of tools, of ways of thinking, depending on what mode you're in, about how to move into futures that center us entangled together in flourishing, that requires us to look at our institutions of higher learning and say, are we rehearsal spaces for creative futures? Are we playgrounds for courageous becoming? Are we incubators for civic imagination? And if we believe in those principles, how do we anchor them in practice? And I think all of you around this Zoom room today and in your own context and your spheres of control, influence, and care do that. And I am grateful to you and for you. I'm going to put my email in the chat because if any of this resonated with you, I'd love to hear more about what it looks like in your own context. What am I missing too? What are the other modes? What else is going on here in your world that you can see the shape of, and that you've used to make the world just a little bit better, more just, more loving every day? So thank you for inviting me. Thank you for letting me play and dream and work out things that are still emerging and messy and not yet published, but are things that I have learned from many of you around this room, and certainly through the Maple League and in caring relationships. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessica. We are just at the top of the hour, so I'm going to ask people to please, if at your own comfort, just wave goodbye to Jessica, and then we can stay a bit longer, but I'll stop the recording. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you. Thank you.